Okay, so this is going to be the most detailed tutorial on the subject, and it's going to be interesting because we can actually look at the underlying architecture of SweetCRM, Sugar CRM Community Edition. So sit back, get some popcorn, and let's get started. So what we're trying to accomplish here is basically add a field to the relationship table, and then make this field editable. So the making of this field editable is a second part of the tutorial, so we're not going to get into it right now. We'll look at the first part. So what we want to do is basically take a simple existing relationship between two modules and then add a field in it that will be displayable, let's just say. So what I mean by that is, for example, we have a connection between a relationship between a custom module UN inventory and the module called contacts. And normally what we'll have inside that relationship is just the ID, date modified, deleted, and then the IDs of the two modules, which are the two records rather, which are being connected. And what we're doing is we're adding two more fields to it, date start and date end. And so when the two records are connected from these two different modules, we can have a different start date and end date. This is not something that's possible currently out of the box. You cannot just click on some stuff inside the studio and get it to work. So we need to do this interesting customization, which is going to explain us basically how the stuff works inside the underlying architecture, as mentioned before. So I'll give the overview, and then we're going to jump in and actually look at the details, the implementation. And this is unfortunately something that's missing from many of the tutorials. So if we look at the additional, the very initial tutorial by Jason, there's some info, but it's a bit of a mishmash of things, and it wouldn't work in its current form for custom modules. Then we have another tutorial by Andy, which is it's like a very high-level overview. Nothing is explained once again properly. I apologize if Andy is listening to this, but it's really high-level. It's only like a person that programmed actually knows the underlying architecture that's going to know what's going on. And then there's another tutorial, by far the best one, by this guy Drifter Jack, which went into details about what he found out, what he learned, etc., etc. So it took me about 2 weeks to figure everything out, and then I lay it all out here in this video. So everything will be crystal clear. So let's just look at the moving parts. So what's actually going on here? So here we have what I would call the host module. So this is the custom module called UN inventory. And this host module, it's going to show a sub panel. So this sub panel here, this is the data that's being pulled from what we'll refer to this as the sub module. So basically this data comes from the contacts module, and it's going to display contacts which are related to this UN inventory record, a contact which is related to this UN inventory record, and it's going to have a custom field which is date start here. So we'll be modifying a number of files. First of all, we'll be modifying the general sub-panel layout of the host module. That means the UN inventory module, the one that's going to host this sub-panel, let's just say. Then we'll modify like the specific module file for this module here. We'll obviously need to modify this file, so it's going to display the custom data here. Then we'll need to modify the metadata file. So the metadata file is the file that's going to add these two custom columns to the database. And then finally we'll modify the var_defs file. So the var_defs file is basically going to define these fields here. So these fields here, they're relationship fields, right? We agree on that. So date start, date end, these are all relationship fields. So they will need to be modified inside the var_defs in order to be displayed in the sub panel. So the sub panel that's here, it can't show you data unless that data is defined inside the var_defs. So that's what we're going to do. So let's take a look at a diagram that basically explains exactly what I mentioned before. So that's a lot of stuff, but actually don't worry about it. So we'll start just with the first part here. So this is the first part. This is just showing the data inside the subpanel, and then the second part is actually how to make this data editable. And it's in two different parts because in a way they're independent, and if we start learning about everything in the first part, then it's going to confuse it's just going to confuse you way too much. So we'll learn about the first part, and then we'll jump on to the second part, which is more complicated, because in your specific case, maybe you don't want users to be editing this data here. Maybe you have some kind of a counter that you're just going to update through a logic hook or something, so you don't care about the user clicking on the edit button, so you don't actually even need the second part. So let's just deal with the first part. So the very first thing that we'll do is we'll add those fields to the database table, the date start and the date end. And the way that we do it is by going to the following file. And before we jump onto this file, there's a very important concept that needs to be explained. So the one that was mentioned in the beginning. So we have the host module, and once again, the host module is the module that's going to host the subpanel, right? That's the host module, and then we have the submodule. The submodule is actually this information here. So this actually comes from a different module altogether, contacts, right? And it's going to show you the contacts record that's related to this record of the host module. So it's very important because that actually gets confusing when I was reading those tutorials. And once that becomes clear, what is edited where, your life becomes much, much easier. So the very first basic step is just to create the two columns inside the relationship table, which is the date start and the date end. And the way we do it is by creating a metadata file, which looks like the following. So this is stored inside the folder called custom metadata, and then UN inventory underscore contacts one metadata. So notice the structure that we have here. We're basically informing the system that for the UN inventory contacts one relationship, which is a many-to-many relationship, we're going to be adding two additional fields, which is the date start and the date end. And then we can basically add it by copying this array here. So that's the step one. Once you do repair and rebuild, it's going to ask you if you would like to add those fields to the database. You're basically going to click accept, and it's going to add those two fields. So now that the fields are available, what we need to do is we need to make them readable by the Sugar CRM architecture. So the way that we do it is those fields need to be defined inside the var_defs file. So it's actually the var_defs file which is going to be defining the data, which is then going to be used inside the specific subpanel definition. So what I mean by that is those are basically the files, the data that's going to appear here. So I'd say this is the most important part of the whole endeavor. This is where you need to be extra careful. So let's jump to the way that this is actually this actually works, so you can see the setup of the system. Since it's whatever you define here, this is what's going to be defined inside the subpanel definition file also. So what we do is we basically copy paste the following file, but you will make the modifications on your side to make it adaptable to your specific case. And the easiest way to do it is first you will define the following variables that you're going to work with. First of all, it's going to be the relationship table. So what is the name of that relationship table that was modified here? In our case, it's going to be UN inventory underscore contacts underscore one underscore C, and underscore C means it's custom. So basically go ahead and define it in your file here. So that's going to be the relationship table, and the relationship name, at least for the custom modules, it's going to be UN inventory underscore contacts one, basically without the underscore C. If you're connecting two existing modules, then you will basically just need to consult the original tutorial, which is here, and it's going to show you what fields, how those fields are defined for built-in modules. It's just like a slight variance, I think, in the link name. Okay, so this is going to be the relationship name, the relationship table, Then we talked about the host module and the subpanel, the sub module, I mean, so that part should be clear. Then we have the columns from the relationship table. So those are the columns that basically come from the relationship table, right? So we have the date end, date start, we have those columns here. So this is basically, this indicates that inside this relationship row, this is the ID of the record of UN inventory, so UN inventory record ID, and then the contacts record ID. So those two records are connected. So you can basically go ahead and outline them in your file here for convenience, because we're going to be referring to these variables here, right? So let's go to the vardefs. And inside the vardefs, just so you're not confused about the section that we should be, the folder that we should be working with, you are working inside the folder of the sub module. So when we look at the graph here, so this is going to be the sub module. The sub module is the contacts module. That's the stuff that's showing us the record. So we can see it here. It's the same color code. It's orange. Sub panel is orange. So we're working inside the sub module folder, right? So you're going to create a vardefs file, which can be named pretty much anything, but just as long as it's in custom extension modules, the right module name, extension vardefs, then this section here. And then you're going to replace the parts that's in orange, you're going to replace it with the relationship name. So if we jump here to the variables, the relationship name is this, followed by underscore fields. So that's not going to vary. Then we're going to define this matches basically this. Then the relationship fields. So it's very simple. So as mentioned before, the relationship fields are basically fields that come from the relationship table. And those fields are defined in the following format. So you have here the actual column name inside the database, another column name inside the database, another column name inside the database. So those are the key value pairs, right? This is the key, this is the value. The key is always the name of the column inside the database, just to drill it so you don't confuse the two. So you see ID here, you see the date start, date end, right? And then you see them matching here. And this is actually the alias. So I just made it extra long and verbose, but that's just for my own reference. And what we're doing here is basically defining this alias is going to be used, this alias is going to be used throughout the code. So once it's defined inside of vardefs, we can go ahead and use the same field inside, for example, the sub-panel modules, inside the custom widgets, etc., etc. And the custom widgets is something we'll look at in part 2 when we're editing those fields. So forget about the custom widgets, but it's the field that is going to be used inside the sub-panel. So once this is defined, what we do is then we must indicate the link. So the link is going to be the relationship name here. So whatever you have as the relationship name in the variables, that's what's going to go here. That's what connects the two modules together. The join link name is going to be the name of the table. So whatever the table is called here, this is what you're going to put here. Underneath, what we're doing is we're basically providing additional information about the fields, about the aliases that were supplied here. So this part is found here. This part is found, this field is found underneath, and then this field is also found underneath here. And this is something that's pretty straightforward. This is just the label, so whatever is going to appear here, this is not defined yet. So once you define it, it's going to look like something that's human readable. And so those other parts you don't need to actually worry about. You just put the sources non-db type data, and then this is going to match this. This is going to match this. Same thing here. And inside this section, you're not going to modify the other parts except for the label. So type as always relate, link type relationship info, non-db, importable, this, and joint primary is always false. If this is not there, then it's not going to work. So once you define this inside your vardefs, you're going to run repair and rebuild, and that's going to make this data available inside the sub panel, right? No, that's actually wrong because we haven't defined the sub panel yet. So let's take a look at how we define the sub panel. So the very first part is just, it's the general sub panel definition. So we're inside the UN inventory table here. So we want to define just the UN inventories, the host module sub panel info. We just want to say that we want to indicate inside that sub panel file that we want to show this specific sub panel info. And the way that we do it here is, don't forget, we're inside the host module, so not contacts but UN inventory. We're going to go to the inside the host modules folder, so it's custom, then we'll go to extension, then we go to the modules, UN inventory. So that's the module that's going to show that little sub panel window. Then we go to, I think it's extension, then layout defs, then okay, why is it like that? Something went wrong along the way. So custom modules. Okay, no, that's the mistake. So it's not custom modules, it's custom, then extension, then modules, then UN inventory, then extension, then layout defs, and then here we're going to look at the UN inventory contacts here. So originally when you're going to open it up, it's going to be at default here. It's just going to show the default sub panel. And what we're going to do is we're going to change it. We're going to give it a different name. So in this case, I'm going to say for UN inventory. So the sub panel name is for UN inventory. And that's great that we're pointing to this specific sub panel name, because then we can create a file called for UN inventory. And then we can define a whole bunch of stuff in it. We can get more granular with the definition. So we're basically telling it, okay, so when you're showing this sub panel here, don't show the default one, show the for UN sub panel. So what this is here is actually going to be a file, and that file is going to be created inside the sub module. So that's very important. The generic definition is done inside the host module here, but the granular definition of this sub panel here is going to come from this sub module, from this sub module, which is contacts, right? It's showing us contacts data. So we're going to go inside the contacts module to define this specific sub panel. Hopefully I'm not too repetitive in my explanations, but I just wanted to be perfectly clear. So we're going to go and take a look at the stuff here at the steps. So what we'll do is we'll just copy the default sub panel, because remember before it was pointed to default. We'll copy the default one and we'll put it inside the custom module contacts metadata sub panels. So we'll put it here. So this was the default one. And the default one is going to be, we're going to modify it. What we're going to do is we're going to modify the, so actually the edit button, you don't even need to worry about it because that's for part 2. That's when we actually make it editable by the end user. But what we need to add is these fields here. We're going to copy it and then we just paste it here. And now if we look at these fields here, if you remember, these actually come from the vardefs, right? So that's the stuff that we were defining, and now we're finally using it. So we're defining the UN inventory contacts 1 field. That's the UN inventory contacts 1 fields. Then the UN inventory contacts 1 ID. That's the UN inventory contacts 1 ID. Then the UN inventory contacts 1 date start, and then the date end. They're also part of that vardefs file. And if you don't define it here, if this was, for example, set to something else, then you're not going to get the data that you need inside the sub panel that you want to display, right? So once we define those fields inside the foreign sub panel definition file, we're going to save it. And this subpanel definition file, once again inside the sub module folder, as shown basically here. We're going to run repair and rebuild, and it's going to show us the data here. So if I go ahead and modify this data inside the database, you're going to see it displayed here. And if we compare it to our original file, so our original diagram, I mean, so we defined the general sub-panel definition. We said, okay, for this specific sub-panel, don't use the default one. Use the forun_inventory.php file, right? Which points to the forun sub-panel, forun_inventory.php file here. And that sub-panel module, that sub-panel file forun_inventory.php is going to use fields that you defined inside the vardefs module. And those fields inside the vardefs module, they connect to the fields, to the columns inside the database table, the relationship table inside your database, which then make them basically available inside the subpanel. Now we're going to move on to the part 2, which is making that data editable by the end user. If you found the video at all helpful or you have any questions, please let me know. I'll make sure to share the file, the Google Doc file as well, that you can use as a template for your own projects. And please subscribe, because I'll be making more of these videos in the future. Thank you.